Welcome to The Secret Truth. I'm George Butler along with Tony Gosling from Bristol, England, and we're going to talk about the recent bridge collapse. How are you doing, Tony? What are you up to?
Pretty good, George. I'll say one thing is I've been looking for many years. It's really the fruit of probably 20 years of research into the Bilderbergs. And the real deep background, which I'm afraid you don't get in the Daniel Estelin books, this kind of thing, which is looking at the way that Bilderberg fits into the arrangement between the Nazis and the Allies at the end of the Second World War. Basically, it was an attempt to unify Europe and America under corporate control.
Yes,
and
exactly.
This is never really spoken about, but quite clearly that's what's going on. Now, the other big clue is the disappearing $1 billion. At the end of the war, and remember, in 1945, the $1 billion was a lot more than it is now. And that was the amount of money that had disappeared at the end of the Second World War from Europe. And the man with these hands on the signatory, effectively, on the accounts, in the various bank accounts, mostly Swiss bank accounts, which held this money, and it was obviously wasn't just cash, it was also precious metals, gold, etc., as well as things like bearer bonds, which are like cash but share certificates. This was Martin Bormann. So, my research into what happened in Arnhem and Nijmegen as part of Operation Market Garden links in with the Red House meeting in August the previous month to Market Garden, and It was quite clear that the Nazis were doing deals with the Allies at that point. Now, there was things that the Nazis had that the Allies wanted, particularly the Americans who were developing the atomic bomb. They wanted enriched uranium. They needed it. They also needed the technology to actually get the bomb to detonate, that is to spark off the bomb. So they had the physics already, but they didn't have the technology to be certain about how to make it actually explode. And the Nazis had been developing. There's strong evidence, more evidence last year, stuff is coming to light now, that there were two nuclear tests by the Nazis in the Second World War. One in North Germany and another one in one of the North Sea islands of Germany. So these weren't big explosions, but the Nazis were testing small bombs. In fact, there's still an area which is contaminated with radiation now in Germany, which you're not allowed to go into. Anyway, people could look up this for themselves. But those deals were being done for safe passage for Nazis. And as we know, after the war, people like Winston Churchill were obsessed with nuking Moscow. And there was a big attempt after the war and towards the end of the war to persuade the Allies to hook up with the Germans and to attack Russia. In fact, that was even going on, wasn't it, during 1941 when Rudolf Hess flew to Britain and tried to get the British to link up with the Nazis and attack Moscow together in 1941, what ended up being Barbarossa, which is when the Nazis attacked the Russians. So there's lots and lots in this, but I'm bringing a lot of these threads together at the scene of the crime next month. That is on the 22nd of September. I'm going over to Holland to Oosterbeek, which is just on the outskirts of Arnhem, which is where the Bilderberg Hotel is, and where the first ever Bilderberg meeting took place in 1954, to do a short seminar, well, maybe an hour or so, really trying to pull these threads together, a kind of presentation, actually in Oosterbeek. So that should be interesting, and I think it's just a way for me to discipline myself in a way, to get some of the information I pulled together into a palatable form. It's probably the most easy way to, I think, for anyone to get a quick handle on this is to look at the article I did back, and I think it was in 2014 or 2015 for Russia Today, which is it's called, the article's title is "A Betrayal Too Far, Only Brutal Honesty Will Do" at Arnhem's 70th anniversary. And the object of that article was to really, most of the people, of course, who were involved in the battle are now dead, any few remaining are dying. So the idea is to try and get that onto paper and put it all together for that 70th anniversary of Operation Market Garden. There was the attempt to liberate Holland in 1944 September, and it was the biggest ever airborne operation in history, where the 82nd Airborne Division did an absolutely amazing job in capturing the Nijmegen Bridge by doing this famous Salt River crossing of the Vaal River. They just paddled across the river, lost half of their men doing it, but they took the other end of the bridge, and then the tanks rolled across, the British tanks, and then they stopped inexplicably. If they'd have carried on, in 20 minutes they could have been over the Rhine, but they just stopped. And we know for a fact there was nothing in the way to stop them, apart from a few security pickets in Elst with rifles in between Nijmegen and Arnhem. So it's one of those bits of history, George, which it sort of unpeels like an onion so much more about what is going on in the world today, particularly the deep state, and who has created it. Well, it's a mixture of the Nazis with the traitors on the Allied side, both British and American, who decided to do deals with Nazis at the end of the Second World War and then funneled that money from the Nazi vaults into the organised crime system, right across the Western world. And so that's why the organised crime is doing so well today, while we see the Mexican drug cartels acting with impunity, why the war on drugs has been so utterly ineffective, is because actually organised crime in the West is now running the show.
Right, it's like Spectre almost, isn't it, huh?
It is exactly the same sort of thing. And it was what happened was Martin Bormann, who survived the war, there's a lot of books saying Hitler did, which is just bunkum. The idea is to just divert attention from Bormann, really. And he went over to Argentina after spending a while in Britain, and what he was doing was an incredible rate of knots. He was creating companies. He was a bureaucrat, basically. And when these companies were created, mostly in European countries and American countries, those companies, he created 750 of them. This is all documented by the brilliant American journalists. Probably one of the greatest American journalists in history that hardly anyone's heard of. That's Paul Manning, who was working for CBS in World War II, broadcasting to the whole of the United States, giving them daily updates on the war in Europe, which, of course, by that time the Americans were very much involved in, as I mentioned, the 82nd and many others, and Patton and the rest of them. And what Paul had done is he pulled together some fascinating facts on what Bormann had been up to, and he realised that there were 750 companies that Bormann had created, and into those companies went the laundered cash from World War II that the Nazis had looted from the whole of Europe, through Sullivan and Cromwell's law firm, the Dulles Brothers law firm in New York, and then up to into these companies, and of course those companies. One of the most amazing revelations from Manning is that Bormann decided to put Jews in charge of many of these companies. And the idea was that if it was a Jewish-run company, that no one would ever suspect that it was Nazi money that was behind it. And so that was a pretty devious thing to do. So what you had was companies set up, but most of the actual directors and the top executives in these firms were former SS members. So they'd taken off their death's head cap, and the SS uniforms, and then put on suits and strolled into the boardroom. But if you lifted up their armpit, you'd probably still find the SS tattoo in their armpit. But obviously, when they were doing business around the world, it's not one of the first things you do is ask someone to take off their jacket, take off their shirt, and have a look under their armpit to see if you were dealing with a Nazi, George.
Boy, Tony, you make some good points. You know that? The research you have done it's just terrific. What you've done,
Tony. Let me just say, it's not really my research, George, because it's the people who've gone before me that have done most of the hard work. That is to say, people like Paul Manning. There's another guy, William Stevenson, who's a Brit, who worked in Canada, in Canadian broadcasting after the war, who wrote a book called The Bormann Brotherhood, and he also wrote a more well-known book called A Man Called Intrepid, which looks into the arrangements between between Winston Churchill back in 1937, 1938, and Roosevelt in order to prepare for war. And they did a lot of groundwork 2 years before the war started, set up offices. I think it was the 37th and 38th floor of the Rockefeller Center in New York. And this is all documented by William Stevenson. And through those offices, they were doing things like creating, it was sending intelligence people into Germany and to Poland, creating an accident for one of the vehicles which was carrying one of the Enigma machines. And so the Nazis thought that their transport had been accidentally caught fire. And what they did is they put a replacement kind of thing machine that looked like an Enigma machine inside it, but what they'd really done is taken the Enigma machine over to New York or into Britain, and they were already a year before the war started. They had the rudiments of code breaking equipment, so that they knew that they would be able to do that during the war. At least they hoped they would. And steal a march on and make sure that the Nazis didn't win. Because I think that there was a lot of intelligence floating around that this war was going to start and that we'd better be ready for a fight. And so, people like William Stevenson, people like Paul Manning, have done a tremendous amount to get that information out to the general public. Another one is John Ainsworth Davis, who was working directly for Ian Fleming during the war, and Ian Fleming was naval intelligence here in the UK, from a banking family, the Fleming banking family, of course most famous for his Bond novels after the war, which are absolutely peppered, George, and they're beautifully written, because he peppers those fictional novels with all sorts of hints of code, facts, that the things that were really going on.
Exactly.
But what he couldn't do, or maybe just didn't have the courage to do it, but no, he didn't feel he could, which is absolutely fine, is break the Official Secrets Act and write a factual account of what had happened. So he managed to put that in novel form. But John Ainsworth Davis, who'd worked very closely with him under the pen name of Christopher Crichton before he died back in the 1990s, wrote a book called Op JB, which details, specifically details this operation to get Martin Bormann out of Nazi Germany from under the noses of the Russians. And so they had to bring Bormann by canoe through the canals of Berlin up to the Wannsee, which is over to the west of Berlin, and then up to meet Desmond Morton, who's really the sort of Crowley-esque figure who was the machinations behind the Second World War. I almost called him Crowley then. Desmond Morton, Major Desmond Morton, who was Churchill's personal secretary. In fact, there's a book all about him called Churchill's Man of Mystery, written by Jill Bennett, who was the librarian to the British Foreign Office. And when she retired, she decided to write about Morton because he was such an interesting character. And anyway, so that Op JB book, which is short for Operation James Bond, it explains the details behind that operation. He also talks, for example, about things like the Dieppe, which is 1941. Stalin, after the war broke out on the Eastern Front, Stalin was getting very, very shirty with Churchill, saying, "What are you playing at? What are you doing? We need to have you getting engaged in the war." And so in 1942, after the war had been raging on the Eastern Front for quite a long time, and the Americans were involved as well, the British sent the Canadians into Dieppe. So this was, I'm not sure how many troops, about 20,000, I think 15,000 Canadian troops, an amphibious assault in Dieppe. And John Ainsworth Davis describes being sent in a few weeks before to Berlin via Switzerland to give the Nazis a prior warning of the Dieppe raid. He was saying that he was some sort of scallywag who just didn't like the Brits and he liked the Nazis, and he was even interviewed by Rommel, and Rommel, only once he realised that he was a double agent did he give him any respect, because he thought the fact that he was such a traitor was an appalling thing. and which is maybe why Rommel was dispatched before the end of the war, because he knew about this stuff. And anyway, so that book Op JB again explains a lot of the answers a lot of the mysteries and the riddles of the Second World War, and we can see that there was definitely a very, I mean, the idea that you're going to betray 15,000 Canadian soldiers just so you can get one double agent to get the confidence of the Nazi high command is just appalling, and I think these histories will be, I think, written in the future. For the moment, the generation that did all these treacherous acts is not long dead, and there are still people, I think, that are rather in denial about admitting that there were so many people at the top, and the British and the American side, that were very happy to do deals with Nazis to offer them safe passage, to have their technology, to have their money, and various other forms of expertise, and then to try and use them against the Soviet Union after the war, and basically to use them to their own advantage to gain power, to gain wealth, and to gain control of the Western political system, which is effectively what these big corporations and these banksters have been doing, George, ever since.
Yes, they have. They've just a bunch of been fascists, Nazis, ex-Nazis, all coming together, haven't they?
Yeah, and I think in the European Union, what you're seeing at the moment is, and that's the main thing I'd like to talk about, if that's all right.
Sure.
Is we've got this, there are various countries that want to leave the European Union that have had enough. It's a very simple situation in a nutshell. It works like this. Anybody that's in the Eurozone, and I can tell you, for example, when Greece was joining the Euro, the Vodafone, and we all know this company, you can go back and check this out if you want, George.
Okay.
But Vodafone spying on the Greek government, and they wanted to know everything that was going on. And the reason we know this is because one of the technicians at Vodafone discovered the spyware on their network, that there was some kind of spyware system on the Vodafone Greek computers, which was, and he wasn't sure who it was actually spying for, but he could see that all of the senior politicians in Greece were being spied on.
Oh my
all of
God.
their calls being recorded, their phones being monitored, even when it looked like the phone wasn't actually on,
Right.
This kind of thing. And he wrote about it. He told his brother about it, and he wrote it in diary, actually, and then he was found dead.
Oh my God.
The engineer was found dead. His brother had a look at his diary, and he said, look, if anything happens to me, in his diary he said this is why, because I've discovered this and I've reported it as I'm supposed to do as a good employee. But I do understand that, maybe that someone's going to get rid of me for discovering this. And so that's the only reason we know. And you can go back to whenever it was, I think it was in the early 2000s when Greece joined the Euro, or late 1990s, I'm not sure of the exact year, and you'll find news stories about this guy from Vodafone Greece, the technician.
Okay.
That was how people were persuaded to join the euro. What's happened ever since is because they're all now on the same currency, the currencies can't float up and down depending on the wealth and the value of the country. So they're all fixed. Back in the old days, the big powerful countries like Germany used to have a very strong currency, and that meant that it wasn't a very good place to go on holiday. It wasn't cheap to go there, etc. And countries like Greece and Italy and Spain, Portugal, were all cheap to go on holiday. What's happened now is because there's only one currency for the whole area, all of the advantages of being a country which has got a low-valued currency are gone. So people have stopped going to the Italy, Greece and these sorts of places on holiday so much. And also the exports are far more expensive from these countries. So they're not able to export. Well, who is able to export? And by the way, this week, right, we've just heard that Germany has got the biggest trade surplus on the planet.
My gosh.
And so everybody realises that the French, the Germans, mainly the Germans, the euro's working in their interests. It's funneling wealth from the periphery of Europe into Germany. And that was always what it was planned to do when the European Economic Community Union was first put together in 1942, designed as a way of running occupied Europe. It was called the Europäische Wirtschaftsgemeinschaft, the EEC, and it translated into English, that's the European Economic Community. And remember, it's an economic union. It's not a democratic union. Okay, it's a way of...
No, it's not democratic at all, is it?
Tying everybody together financially.
Yeah.
And so, all around Europe, people are realising the Brits, thank God, didn't get rid of the pound. I mean, that was because, I suppose, of the power and the strength of the City of London and their insight into the way money works. And thank God we didn't, because lots and lots of people are now... And anyway, so the long and short of it is the Italians, back in the beginning of the year, I think it was in January actually, elected a Eurosceptic government. I mean, in fact, they didn't actually have a government straight away, but they elected the two most powerful parties. The biggest parties were the right-wing and the left-wing Eurosceptic party. That's the Lega, the right-wing one, and the Five Star Movement, the left-wing one. And those two parties were trying to form a government. But because the various prime ministers and finance ministers they wanted to put in place were Brussels and anti the European Central Bank, which is based in Frankfurt, and they were saying we're going to have to get rid of the euro, this sort of thing, they weren't allowed to take office. They were also talking about getting rid of, basically cancelling billions of debt. And so they weren't allowed to take office, and the president was vetoing this, right? And then back in May, end of May, just before the Bilderberg conference, which of course was also in Italy this year, just before that conference, they finally agreed, oh, okay, we won't cancel the debt. And then so they were allowed to have who the president of Italy and the European Central Bank told them could be their finance minister and their prime minister. So they've got basically the opposite people running the country to what the country voted for in the general election. So that's where we are in Italy, is you've got the people voting and voting away, saying, no, we don't like the euro, it's killing this country, it's destroying this country. We've also got this crazy migrant crisis, no one's doing anything about it. The people that are supposed to control the Mediterranean, which is the European Border Agency, are doing nothing to stop these migrants coming over, economic migrants, almost all of them, by the way. And, they're it's a bit like the Mexican border, you know, people are just going for an adventure to try and make some money for their families, which is fine, but if the legislators are saying we don't want this, then they should be able to stop it.
Right.
And what's happening, of course, is the Euro border people are hopeless. In fact, they're part of the mafia. Because this is a mafia operation, really, to bring in cheap labour. And then when people have got nowhere to live, the camps for the migrants are run by the mafia. So they're taking loads more government money. So you've got an awful situation in Italy, just as is happening in Greece and other places, where the people have had enough of austerity. There's no proper social security, so if people haven't got a job, then they just have to beg, basically. So there's nowhere to get jobs, and if you haven't got a job, tough. So what's happening is the youth are leaving the country. So you've got a horrendous situation in the periphery of Europe. And that's why I think that the evidence for this bridge collapse in Genoa points towards this battle that's going on between the European Central Bank, mainly, and they seem to be in charge. Brussels is almost peripheral to them, and Rome. And that's why, because Genoa is the headquarters of the main government party, which is Movement 5 Star, the 5 Star Movement, and Pepe Grillo, the leader of that group's home is Genoa. So this happening in Genoa sends a very strong signal, if it is an explosion of the bridge, because that's what we're looking at here. The evidence is starting to stack up that there were explosions.
Okay.
It wasn't just a bridge collapse. And I mean, if you want, George, we can run through some of that evidence.
Yeah, go ahead, Tony. Elaborate on that.
I was shocked that there's so few people looked into this as a potential, because what is the fact is people don't realise there's this enormous tension behind the scenes in Europe, where you've got national governments trying to do what the electors have asked them or told them to do. Like in Greece, they voted not to accept the bailout, and then the government had to accept the bailout. So, democracy is being smashed to pieces. And in the home of democracy, which is Greece, at the heart of, I think, of the tension are these sorts of acts, possible terrorist acts by the powers that be in Europe, just to basically threaten the government of Italy to say, well, look, if you don't do as we say, it's very simple mafia tactics. If you don't do as we say, you'll have terror. There will be terror in your country. Bridges will fall down, and they're threatening them. That's what I think, George.
You think it's part of the Gladio thing? That's just a sort of a Gladio operation, or what?
Well, look, Gladio, I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
What I'm saying here, Gladio is documented in Italy.
Right.
Terror attacks.
Yeah.
Terror attacks by the state in the past.
Right.
Which were being done through, for example, the P2 Freemasons Lodge.
Right.
In Italy. But anyway, the evidence is starting to stack up, as I say, about the potential of this bridge collapsing. Let's just run through some of the points.
Go ahead.
First of all, I would suggest anyone looking at this, and this is the original source for this material for me, Manfred Petrisch's blog. He's a former Swiss banker who has, shall we say, kind of gone native, really. He's gone over to live in Abkhazia on the Black Sea, which is part of the Russian Federation, and he's just had enough of the West. He said in Switzerland the politicians are hopeless, and the whole political system is riddled with corruption. And I saw it he saw it as a banker. Anyway, so he's from what runs something called All Smoke and Mirrors blog, which is in German, Alice Schauenrausch, and he really writes for a German audience.
Okay.
But you can get the various translation things to translate his articles. And if you look for ASR blog Genoa, or Alice Schauenrausch, or All Smoke and Mirrors, and you'll find his stuff. And in fact, maybe the easiest way to go to my show page, the radio show we do in Bristol, that's thisweek.org.uk, and you'll find the links for this week's programme. If you go to the show for the 24th of August 2018, you'll find the links there to ASR, to Alice Schauenrausch blog. Anyway, so he's saying, look, he's making some very good points, that the CCTV, the pictures that have been released, first of all, they're they're peripheral, right? So we're looking at nearby somewhere, sort of a very difficult to see the bridge angle, one sort or another. Some of the CCTV is actually under the bridge, so all you see is a sort of giant cloud of smoke. And you don't actually see the bridge collapse, so we can't see how it collapsed and what order it collapsed in. For example, how the massive tower, there was one massive tower that came down with the roadway both sides of it, how it actually came down. Because if you look at the way that the concrete has been pulverised, it looks to me as if the tower should have fallen one way or another, reasonably intact. But it didn't. It's almost fallen straight down on top of itself. And there's an enormous amount of rubble right on. I'm no expert in these things, but I would have thought that the tower fell, it would fall one way or the other way. But anyway, like I say, I'm not an expert on it. But anyway, all those three bits of CCTV, one shot by a guy who just heard a big bang and has pointed his camera over there and started shouting, "Oh God, as the actual tower fell down." You can see just about the tip of the tower. All those three videos show flashes, quite large flashes. Now, what they show is it looks like two flashes. Now, whether that's an explosion, I don't know, but it certainly looks suspicious. And what Manfred's pointed out was that the flashes may be because there was a railway line underneath the bridge, that when the roadway fell onto the railway, it may have been that they smashed those pylons, that carry the overhead electricity wires on the railway.
Oh yeah,
so
yeah.
He's also said that actually, if it did fall onto them, it would probably smother the sound, the sight of the actual flash. So he's suggesting immediately explosives. He's also pointing out that bridges are designed to be blown up nowadays. After World War II, most bridges that are built in Europe, he says, are and he certainly knows his stuff in Switzerland, this is certainly the case, they have compartments, special compartments to put explosives to blow that bridge up. They learnt this in the Second World War, that it can be extremely useful to be able to bring down a bridge if there's a war and you don't want the enemy to use it.
Right.
And I'm not necessarily saying that there would be a war between Italy and France,
right.
but they realised that this was a design flaw in the bridges that had been built in the early part of the 20th century, was that sometimes they could be pretty awkward to blow up. So they started building these into the design of bridges to make them easier to blow up in wartime. So that's one thing. You've got these 3 bits of CCTV which have been released today, all of which show flashes. And then there's no CCTV has been released whatsoever showing the bridge going down. And there must be a lot of it, because there are loads of cameras all up and down that road.
Right.
Controlled and run by this private company, Autostrada. And you can imagine, at least I think, yes, you can imagine, that those Autostrada photos would definitely be. I mean, they've shown pictures of the CCTV control room. So they've got loads of feeds coming in, and they're saying now there's nothing. There's nothing.
Oh my
God! And they
God.
called it in the Italian press a blackout.
Yeah.
Now hang on a minute. Rather than saying, "Oh, we've given them to the police are looking at them," blah blah blah, they're now saying there is no CCTV. Well, I don't believe them. Okay. You've got cameras all the way up and down this road, and you've got a control room, you've got CCTV feeds. This is a private company, Autostrada. They are certainly more loyal to Brussels and big business and the big banksters and Goldman Sachs and Mario Draghi at the European Central Bank than they are to Pepe Grillo and the Lega, the government in Italy. So, that's I think, one of the fault lines is that you've got an enormous great company that controls much of the infrastructure in Italy that is not loyal to the Italian government, it's loyal to Brussels. And of course Brussels is now involved with almost all the funding for things like these major road projects, so they are friends with Brussels. They're not interested in Italy, in Rome and the government there. The other thing is this, so far I've seen 4 eyewitness reports of loud bangs or explosions. One of whom, by the way, was driving along the road when his car went off the end of the road and down 100 feet or so, whatever it is. It must be 50 metres almost. And then his car hit the bottom, but he survived. His airbags went off, and he managed to survive. And he almost walked out of the car. Anyway, I mean, he was probably taken out by the hospital people, ambulances and whatever.
Right.
But he said he heard an enormous an enormous bang. He said.
Right.
Another guy who said he heard an enormous bang nearby, and he was blown not by the rubble, but by a shockwave. Out of the side of his vehicle and across the road. He was actually blown across. Another one, there's talk of cars being blown sideways and bouncing up and down on their tyres.
Golly, man.
So, the talks of explosions and loud bangs as well as flashes, well, what does that mean?
My gosh, that's good evidence.
Conclusions.
Yeah.
Obviously, if a roadway fell down and hit the deck, there would be a bang of some sort. So it may be that that's what they've heard. But, I mean, how can you hear a bang before the roadway falls down? Which is what this guy in the car was saying, or as the roadway is falling down.
Right.
The other thing is that there is a lot of talk about the bridge being in a very bad condition. This apparently is not true. The bridge apparently was well maintained. In fact, it was used by architectural engineers as an example of a bridge and how to maintain it. And it had been well looked after. It was in good condition, apparently. Also, at the time when it collapsed, it wasn't under a tremendous amount of load. There wasn't heavy traffic on it. That bridge is sometimes absolutely jam-packed with traffic jams. And you imagine if there's a lot of lorries on there, it's going to be a lot more stress on the bridge. So there was when this accident happened. So there are structural engineers who are talking about this and saying, well, actually, that bridge was one of the most well looked at by the profession to make sure that it was in good condition. So this is the thing, is that we're hearing these things from the press, and what Manfred points out is that when you have some sort of event like this, that there is, alongside, if it is an explosion that's brought that down, if it is a threat to the government, if this whole thing is what he's suggesting it is, you also have a parallel media narrative which comes out around about the same time to say, oh, the bridge was in a very, very bad state, So they just shove this stuff out through the media. So the idea is really to just wrong for anyone that's trying to inquire into it and to provide, convenient excuses to the world as to why something like that might happen. But if you look deeper into it, you'll find the bridge apparently was in very good condition and had been very well looked after.
Right.
So, as I said, also, you've got the explosion which happened in Turin at the Lega party. So the two, you've got an attack on the Lega party, two bombs, apparently, at the Turin offices of the Lega party, 2 days after this bridge came down, and then Genoa, where the bridge came down, which is the home of the Five Star Movement. So that's the two coalition allies, the right wing and the left wing Eurosceptics, both getting bombed, if you believe that the bridge was bombed. And also this whole idea of wanting a parallel currency to the euro. Well, Forbes magazine, this new Italian government, which is what it's promised to do something about the euro when it got elected. And it's not going to be allowed to do that. Forbes is saying this is the biggest threat to the Eurozone, is the Italians' plan to put in a parallel currency which they can, at any point they can then jettison the euro. So this is a major threat to the European Central Bank. As they see it, of course, it's the democratic will of the people. So that means, doesn't it, that the politicians, as I said, can't do what they promised the voters that they would do. And that, I think, sums it up, really, is that you've got an attack on democracy going on from the European Central Bank in Frankfurt, from the EU in Brussels, and the elected government cannot do what it wants to do because the finance minister and the prime minister are both technocrats who've been imposed on the country. There's no democracy left in Italy, really. And as I said, you've got these previous, you had the whole massive campaign of Gladio, mainly in the 1970s,
right.
going on in Italy, which is just, loads of state terror, the years of lead, state terrorism. And that was also, by the way, linked to the Bilderbergers by Ferdinando Posimato in the book he wrote. He was the chairman of the Italian Supreme Court. He wrote all about that. So I would imagine that there will be a few more people in Italy starting to question this, George, and I hope so, certainly hope so. But for me, the main evidence is we haven't seen CCTV of the bridge collapsing, and there are cameras all the way up and down that road, on many of the pylons, things like that. The road is constantly monitored. The flow of traffic, etc., constantly monitored. And so if there's an accident, they can get a recovery vehicle in there because there's no like hard shoulder where you can pull over to the side. So particularly on busy days, an accident or a breakdown, for example, on that bridge could cause absolute chaos. So they need to keep cameras on it. They've got cameras on it. Let's see the footage. And until you show us the footage, we're going to be suspicious that you're not showing us that footage because there may even be evidence of an explosion in that footage, in those films, as of course there was after the 9/11 attacks, George. And without those bits of footage of the collapse of the World Trade Center, for example, the analysis would not have been able to have been done that proved that it was a controlled demolition.
Right. These masses can be so easily persuaded, can't they, with these kinds of...
it's the media I blame.
Yeah, it's the media. Yeah.
I don't blame so much because people just trust the press. And anyone like me who's worked in the mainstream press knows you can't trust the press. The people who are running it are not running it for you. They're running it for them and their mates. And now it's become so easy to control what we see and hear, particularly through the broadcast media. And also because the media is in so few rich people's hands. It's not in the hands of ordinary people, and there seems to be very little checks and balances, to make sure that when a media does report wrongly, like, for example, on 9/11, like on 7/7, for example, like on the economy at the moment, we've got Mervyn King. You'll get a little tiny line in the news, but no proper analysis. We've got £166 trillion. I don't know how much that is in dollars. It's probably $200 trillion debt overhang. Right? So that means that those $200 trillion could be just fiction. So that's the money that's sitting on balance sheets and company accounts, which makes them look as if they're healthy, but it's actually fiction. So if that money was to have to be realised, someone was to say, well, let's see the real value of that money, turn it into money if you can. This is really false accounting, and again, the problem really there is that you've got auditors who are colluding to prop companies up that are actually broke.
Yeah, they're bankrupt, but on paper they look okay. That's it.
That's right. And if you had to actually turn what is written on the balance sheet into real money...
Into a real asset, they wouldn't be there. They couldn't do it. Yeah.
It's just fictional figures on a balance sheet, George. But at $200 trillion, I'm not kidding. Go and have a look. Mervyn King in February, the former governor of the Bank of England, said there's going to be another crash because we have a £166 trillion debt overhang.
Right.
And that means that at some point that is going to crash, and it's going to be one hell of a crash. And there won't be money left to bail out anybody. Those banks are going to be gone. I imagine, I would have thought that the banks themselves and the banksters will be making contingencies to make sure that they've still got plenty of cash. But they will be saying to us, sorry, all your money's gone, folks.
Yeah, the HSBC moved back to Hong Kong. Is that correct?
I haven't realised that. I haven't followed that.
Yeah, they had their offices in London, their main office, and I think they moved back within the last year to Hong Kong.
Well, you know what? Hong Kong is a bit of a hot potato too.
Yeah. Man,
the Chinese have just done their biggest exercises ever off Hong Kong.
Exactly.
At the same time as... What is amazing, isn't it? The contrast between those two events. I'd love to have a camera with a telephoto lens to focus first on the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong, which was where the young Hong Kong Nationalist Party activist did a speech, and to zoom in on him in there, and then to pan around and get a picture then straight, with no cutting, to the Chinese warships surrounding Hong Kong doing their biggest ever exercise, which is just a threat on free speech. Let's make no bones about it. I mean, there may at some point in the future be a major war between China and the United States, or China and NATO. Certainly, there's that what's been happening in the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands, all that kind of stuff is building up for it. Installing these new cruise missile batteries in Taiwan is not the friendliest thing that the Americans have ever done. But that doesn't mean to say that the Chinese are right, because President Xi he's installed himself as a kind of pope. He's not allowed, everything he says
exactly.
is President Xi speak, and he's infallible.
He's like a king or a pope, sitting infallible. Yeah.
Well, if you say, I think the president's wrong, you better make sure that there's no police around at the time. Yeah,
exactly.
That's what we're talking about.
And you certainly don't do anything in Tiananmen Square either. They'll arrest you and put you in prison forever.
Well, the other thing you're not allowed to do is to laugh at the national anthem or disrespect the flag. So, I mean, they've got a serious problem with a lack of sense of humour, I'm afraid, at the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. And so this is what's looming over poor old Hong Kong. And, Hong Kong is not perfect. It's a colonial state, of course, and it's the Brits doing their stuff in the past, which, of course, was wrong. But what they do have is they do have freedom of religion, and they do have freedom of speech. And the Chinese are starting to, it's like where the rubber hits the road, yeah? So China taking over Hong Kong, it was supposed to leave it for 50 years and not interfere. But it's now starting to say, well, no, you're not allowed to have free speech in Hong Kong. Well, hang on a minute, you said you were going to allow it for 50 years. So it's a very, I wouldn't say HSBC Bank is necessarily safe in Hong Kong, unless, of course, and this is probably what we are looking at, the big banks are in collusion with the people that want to start these wars.
They're all together, Tony. They're all together.
Like Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, look, in Israel, isn't it amazing? I was just looking up who the Israeli foreign minister is. Do you know, George?
Not right offhand, no. I don't.
It's a good question, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's Benjamin Netanyahu. He doesn't have a foreign minister.
Oh, he's one and the same, huh?
He's Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. So it stops any arguments, yeah? And he probably had a succession of foreign ministers he would be having a row with and sacking. So he's just made himself Foreign Minister. And I just found that almost hilarious. I mean, it just shows you that there's these kind of egos out there that are really not interested in. They're interested in themselves. They're not interested in what ordinary people want. And I'm afraid the problem is, because of the power of the power elite, you've got media moguls who are basically in bed with some of these international criminals who are now running the big banks and the big corporations, and they are not interested in countries. I mean, there's a book just out apparently in the States, and one of the professors at Sonoma University just brought out over in California, that looks at this, the way that the corporations are now in the driving seat, and the nation state is just a kind of piece of fiction which is fading into the distance. And that people will still talk about this country, that country, but actually it's the big corporations that oversee them all, including things like the European Central Bank and the European Union, which was always designed to. The main point of the EU is to dissolve all borders within Europe, and that is
right, and go to a single currency that would dominate economically that
that's
union.
Right. The big companies can just do what they want. They can move their stuff. They can trade. No one can.
That's why on the inauguration day,
to be successful, I just hope that we manage to get away with Brexit. Now, this is one of the other things I'd like to say. I don't know how we're doing for time.
Yeah, go ahead. We've got about 5 minutes left.
But with Brexit, first of all, it's looking like there's going to be no deal. Now, they're trying to say in the press here, as they always do, it's going to be terrible if there's no deal. No, it's not going to be that terrible. They're making it out to look something like a big disaster. No, we'll survive a no deal. We can cope. Britain can cope as an independent country. We're reasonably wealthy. And, of course, they will still want to sell goods to us. But I am concerned that the financial ramifications will be big. That is to say, they're talking now about property prices in Britain dropping by a third after Brexit. And I have no idea whether that's right or wrong, but when the experts start to say things like that, then that does bother me, because that could precipitate a crash, George.
Right.
It could precipitate basically we've got a property bubble, and we've got a stock market bubble which has been being blown up massively faster ever since 2008, the bailouts, by all this quantitative easing. And this is just fictional money that's trying to keep the economy, making it look like it's going, when actually it's dead. There is no productivity in most of these companies. They're being kept up artificially, all these big corporations. And so if you get something like a reset in the property market, wow, man, that really could precipitate a massive crash. And that would have ramifications right around the world. It wouldn't just be the Eurodollar zone and the pound zone, obviously. It would also impact Africa, it would impact Russia, it would impact China, which of course is massively holding a lot of the debt from the UK, US, etc. And it would mean that they wouldn't be going to get paid. So I think Brexit could actually create a wave going right around the world. All I'd say is, if any of your listeners have got property and they're thinking of buying it, selling it at some point, get it done before Brexit. That's all I'd say. Because afterwards you might find that your property values are way, way less. And, of course, this might sound like a terrible thing, a crash. But as we know from the history of the Rothschilds, you can make a absolute fantastic amount of money out of a financial crash. This to them is the perfect money-making opportunity. In fact, they make more money in a crash, the banksters, than at any other point. So they don't like peace. They much prefer war, which they can make money from, and crashes, which they make money from. So we really need to rein in these people, because they could bring about some kind of an Armageddon, serious, crazy stuff going on planet Earth, with millions and millions, billions of people affected. And they're rubbing their hands saying, well, that would make a lot of money out of that. And yet there are people dead across the world, people starving, and people destitute and homeless with no job. And they're turning the world into a miserable place for their own private profit, George.
Well, they've not mentioned derivatives lately. Have you heard that? I haven't heard that being addressed at all. That's some of the false credits on these books.
Well, and also that's one of the ways that you make a lot of money out of pre-knowing about. I mean, it's basically insider dealings going on all the time now.
Right.
In London, there is not even a pretense of prosecuting anybody for committing any kind of financial crimes. It's basically, we're now living in the world of whatever you can get away with, go for it. Because the legal system, the rule of law, and this is really what it comes down to, George. At the end of the day, the rule of law is gone. There is no law. The only law is do what you can get away with. And, of course, you can use money to bribe your way and friendship to bribe your way through the courts and get off scot-free. And we're seeing decision after decision going the way of the big guys against what you suspect would be natural justice, which is a great pity. But I mean, I think the Brits are sort of stealing themselves for Brexit. We've been through. We had the invasion by Rome.
right.
1943
Man.
AD. We had the Normans turned up in 1066.
Right. Here we are, the Normans.
And we've had various waves of invasions over the centuries, and then we had to fight the Second World War basically on our own for a few years against Nazi Germany. So we've managed a few times. I think we'll come out of Brexit smiling.
I think so too. I think you will.
It's going to be a tough road.
The Brits are tough people. You know that? Huh? They are, Tony. The British are tough people.
Good people. I mean, we've been the bullies of the world for many years, but the Americans have taken over after World War II. You Americans took over to being the bullies of the world from us.
Yeah. We've got about 2.5 minutes. What would be your final closing statements? And give us your contact points too, Tony.
Well, okay, so let's just run through. I mean, I do something called the 9/11 Forum, which is 911forum.org.uk, which I started along with Ian Henshall, the author of 9/11 and New Evidence, and various other people, back in 2003, gosh, a long time ago now. And that forum looks at all sorts of terror events. I posted some stuff up there about Genoa and various other people that posted bits and pieces. Things like eyewitness statements about hearing loud bangs and explosions, this sort of thing. But we really look at all sorts of geopolitical stuff on there. Almost every country on the planet has got a little section where you can see what's really been going on. The idea is looking at the backstory. So that's 9/11 Forum. At the number 911.org.uk, and then I also do the Bilderberg website, which is bilderberg.org, and there's a forum on there too. And I'm doing this seminar over in Holland, in Oosterbeek.
Now, I could get some of my friends down there to film that for you.
That would be great if you can, George. It's the 22nd of September.
Yeah, hit me an email on that or put it on the text message to me.
I will do, yeah. It's at Creek Oosterbeek, which is in Oosterbeek. It's just a sort of cultural arts.
Yeah, that is the city that the Bilderberg Hotel is in.
Well, you see, the significance of Oosterbeek is it's also where the British were massacred at Arnhem.
Okay.
Thousands and thousands were captured. It was called the Witch's Cauldron, the Hexen Kettle.
That's why they had the Bilderberg meeting there, wasn't it, Tony?
And that's why they started the Bilderberg conferences there 10 years after the battle, yeah.
I think that commemorated it for the Nazis. Huh?
Sorry?
I think it commemorated it for the Nazis.
Well, it was basically an in-joke. Yeah?
That's what I'm saying.
This is where we killed the Brits.
Exactly. We're going to have our meeting here where we kill the Brits.
They had Prince Bernhard and Lord Carrington, who were both later to become Bilderberg chairman, were on the British side in the battle, and I'm pretty certain, well, I'm absolutely certain that Bernhard was involved in betraying the plans to the Nazis before the paratroopers ever landed. But let me just say that 82nd Airborne put up a hell of a fight, and I spoke to Moffat Burrows, who was the captain in the 82nd, and he explained how he put a gun to Carrington's head when he was sitting in his tank, and the Sherman tank heading for Ireland, and he said, "Get down that blankety-blank road before I blow your blankety-blank head off." So, the Americans did an amazing job trying to win that battle, but it looks to me as if there were traitors within the British side that were never intended to win it, because they wanted to actually extend the war. They wanted to allow the Germans time to squirrel their money away in other parts of the world, and they were doing deals with them at the time. They didn't really want to win the battle, and as a result, thousands of British paratroopers were killed or captured. Finally, my politics show is on every Friday evening in Bristol, UK, the city that sent the Matthew and John Cabot to so-called discover North America back in 1497, and an old Templar city, and you can find that show on thisweek.org.uk, George.
Yeah, what did you cover this last week on your program? We've got about 2 or 3 more minutes, really.
We covered. We always have a local politician on of some sort, and we covered the house price collapse in Britain, which is down £7,000 on average right across the country. There is no place in Britain where house prices are staying the same or rising. They're falling all over the country.
Really?
And we also covered the fall in real wages. So there's been a massive fall in real wages, because although more people are working, many of those people are not even bringing home enough money to pay the rent and pay the bills. So, what we're looking at is like a kind of slave economy. So we looked at that, and then, of course, we also looked at what's been happening in the States. Donald Trump and this moves to impeach him, basically to threaten him.
Right.
And to try to do what the New World Order wants him to do, or the deep state wants him to do, which, of course, is supporting Netanyahu in having a war with Iran and putting sanctions on Iran.
Exactly.
The latest boogeymen, So we've had Saddam, we've had Gaddafi, we've had Assad, we're having Putin, and the latest boogeyman is Rouhani, and we're going to have some sort of... But basically that's just doing what the Israelis want. There's no interest whatever for the Americans, anyone in America, to have a war with Iran, except for Netanyahu, and it shows just what power the Israelis have in US politics.
Oh, there was something that just came up today, Tony, in Iran, okay? The steel workers there at one of the plants they're making steel went on protest for past wages in the rears. That's in Iran. I just picked it up this morning over breakfast.
Yeah, that's right. Well, their economy is not doing well.
So it could blow up.
They've had lots of flips backwards and forwards in Iran, with the American embassy basically running the country up until the 1979 revolution.
But that thing could go into another revolution
I think they
quick.
get the house in order, and luckily I've been... that I was interviewed by an Iranian newspaper about 6 or 8 months ago, and I said precisely this: government has got to get your economy working. You've got to make sure that people have got working conditions. Otherwise, it gives an excuse for the CIA and MI6 to come in and start demonstrations to destabilize.
That's what's going to happen. The economy is going to take it down. That's what's going to happen. Well, thank you for being with us this evening, Tony, and you're doing a fine job over there. I want to really thank you for all your hard work. Okay.